I would try and give a little demonstration of some of the in-game tools that Horizon Zero Dawn utilizes for their photo mode. We're going to get right started, just jump right into it. As you can see, I've already got a little bit of a shot set up here, already in photo mode. In case you don't know how to access that, if you just press options on your PlayStation 4, it's pretty self-explanatory, but go ahead and press options and you'll see photo mode there in the lower left corner. Press that, goes right into the photo mode. So I'm going to change my camera up a little bit, and actually, so you know kind of how to do this. Of course, the left stick, assuming you're on a PlayStation 4, the left stick allows you to move the camera in, out, left, right. The left trigger and the right trigger, L2 and R2, they allow you to move the camera up and down. So L2 brings the camera down, R2 brings the camera up. So you see kind of how that works. The right stick basically orbits around Aloy, or rather around where you are. If I'm over here, not looking at her, then the right stick orbits from that center point where I am here. So that can get a little disorienting at times, gets a little confusing, but you'll get the hang of it. So let's compose a little quick shot. I think something like this works actually. Why not? We're just going to use Aloy as our model. So to start off, field of view. Field of view is pretty self-explanatory. The larger the number, the greater your field of view, as you see here. So I can see more of the side. It's more widescreen in effect. Imagine kind of like a fisheye lens where you see more of the side of the image as opposed to very close. A tight field of view sort of acts like a zoom. I wouldn't rely on it as a zoom. It gets a little disorienting when trying to move the camera around like this, as you see. It's very confusing. So I'm just going to bring it out to about here. Gives me a nice angle. The view roll. View roll is great. It adds sort of a dynamic to your shot. You see how this is a little more interesting than just a straight flat shot. Traditionally, most shots are done this way, but everybody has a different eye, everybody has a different technique. This is really good for action shots. Say she's in the middle of jumping or she's fired an arrow, you can throw this in there. It just adds a little bit of a feel of movement to your photo. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and bring this back to zero, to level. So hide player. Hide player is really nice. A lot of in-game photo modes, in fact, I don't know of any photo mode besides this one that hides the player, which is nice because, like, say I love this shot, but she's in the way. Well, I can get rid of her. It's great. Now it's like I'm just standing there in the world with a camera. So I love this. It's a simple little tool, but it's really handy. Let's go ahead and leave her on. Facial expressions, really nice. You can see she's sort of changing the way she looks a little bit. Let's give her a kind of a confused, like, kind of look. And let's change her body pose a little. There we go. That looks nice. She looks very powerful and dominating. And now her facial expression doesn't quite look like it matches. There we go. I like that one. So also too, one thing with the Horizon Dawn Zero photo mode, if you press down on the left stick, she'll just immediately look at the camera. And the nice thing is if you move the camera, she'll continue to look at you. So that's really awesome. It's kind of interesting that you can have a selfie mode basically for an in-game character, but why not? I like this actually. Let's just do this shot here. So that is in essence the very first of the tool sets: field of view, view roll, hide player, etc., etc. So if you press the R1, you'll move over to the next thing: depth of field, focal distance, and aperture. This might be pretty self-explanatory as well, as you see. Well, actually, let me do this here. There we go. That'll show it better. So depth of field on versus off. The background comes into focus. Everything is clear. There is no depth of field. Everything is at the same focus. Sometimes in photography, though, having the background sharp distracts you from maybe something you want to see in the foreground. So if you only want Aloy to be visible or to be the subject of the photo, then you can put on a depth of field that blurs the background, and as you see, you just automatically begin to focus on Aloy, or what's in the foreground, more than in the background. And of course, this can work in the opposite way too, which I'll show you here in a little bit. But let's go ahead and explain focus distance. So focus distance as well is pretty self-explanatory. Right now it's set at 3.4 meters, which is, my math is probably a little off, but roughly 10 to 12 feet-ish. Um, so the aperture. Aperture is a little more difficult to explain. You could have an entire class on aperture settings, so I'll try and keep it simple. Um, Basically, when you take a shot on a traditional camera in front of, if it's a digital camera, in front of the sensor, which is what actually detects the light, or if it's a traditional old camera, then it'll be something that's in front of the film itself. But basically, when you take a picture, there is what's called the aperture, and it opens and closes really fast. So if you have a really high aperture, then it only opens just a little. I know that seems counterintuitive, high number, lower, smaller aperture, but that's just the way it is. So if you have a really high number on a real camera, then the aperture opens just a little bit. And that basically means that light can only come in pretty much at a straight angle or a straight shot. So everything is in focus. I know this doesn't make sense. Like I said, there's an entire class that you could take on this, but just bear with me. So if I have a high aperture, it brings more into focus. Just remember that. A higher number means a higher amount of focus. So if I lower the number, and on a real camera, when you have a lower f-stop, is what this is called, f4, f2.8. When you have a lower f-stop, it means that less is going to be in focus. The aperture actually opens really wide, opens way up, real big, and this allows different angles of light to come in. It's way too much to explain here, but just trust me. So if I bring the aperture way down, then my focus is going to be really small. In fact, I'm probably going to have to bring my focus distance really down to get her in focus, like 1.3 meters. She's probably about 3 or 4 feet away from the camera. So if I bring the focus distance up, this is what I was explaining earlier. If I bring the focus distance up, I don't know how far I can get this out. Let's go way far out. Okay, yeah, I'm not going to be able to get that in focus, but you see, as I moved up through the focus distance, the back parts of the background became more in focus, and the foreground became less in focus. And that's because I have a really wide aperture at the same time that I'm playing with this focus distance. It gets confusing, I know, but this is very critical. This is a very critical part of taking photos. So let's kind of backtrack a little. Let's make this a little more practical. Let's bring this close. Now, like I said earlier, I want Aloy to be in focus. I want to blur the background. So I'm going to bring the aperture up just a little. Bring the focus distance in. Okay, there we go. I like that. Actually, let's bring it in a little more. Now let's bring the aperture down. Bring focus distance in a little more. In fact, I said she was about 4 feet away, so let's do roughly there. So I want the background to be out of focus. So set the aperture f4, focus distance 1.4 meters. That ensures she's in focus. Everything behind her is out of focus. So that's pretty much that. I know that was really in depth. I might not have explained it the best. It's difficult. But just play around with these settings. You'll get used to it. You'll start to understand what aperture does, and you'll start to understand focus distance. I promise you, it's easier than it sounds. So let's move on to the next thing. So the brightness, overexposure, colorize, you don't have to do that. We'll go over that. And intensity. So brightness, again, pretty self-explanatory. Bring it down, makes the image darker. Bring it up, makes the image brighter. The only problem, a lot of people take photos with really high brightness. This is common in real photography too. People don't pay attention to their exposure settings and their brightness, and then they get these washed out kind of photos. So you see the colors aren't too vibrant. Everything seems sort of well washed out. So if I bring the brightness down just a little, I don't want it too dark. maybe here. Colors are a little bit more vibrant, maybe more real to life, maybe how the eye would see it. The overexposure, you can really adjust how exposed the image is. In real life, this is basically just the amount of light coming in to the camera. If you have a low exposure, it's a really quick shot. That aperture I was talking about is just open for just a moment, not just a fraction of a second. And that means very little light from your subject is actually hitting the film or the sensor if it's a digital camera. So it doesn't have much time to really pick up the light that's out there. So it's really dark. Now, if I took an overexposed shot on a real camera, then that means that that aperture is open longer, maybe a quarter of a second versus maybe 1,000th of a second. So a quarter of a second, more light comes in. There's more time for more light. So it really oversaturates the image or overexposes the image. So a lot of people end up taking pictures like this, not paying attention to their exposure. But the nice thing about in-game photography is, well, you don't waste film, and you can control it perfectly right here. I like to have my shots maybe a little brighter. I used to, be in the habit of taking dark shots, but I kind of got out of that. I got a lot of critique about that. People not really liking it. It's hard to see the image. And this also compensates. A lot of people have their screens set to um, a darker brightness, maybe on their iPhone or their computer. So if you take a dark photo and then they have their brightness way down on their device, the photo may end up looking like this. So you'll want to keep that in mind. So maybe just a hair brighter than you might want to take it, or you might feel like it needs to be. Colorize, this is basically filters like Instagram has, pretty much any social media platform that deals in photos. You can play with these. I personally don't use these too much because if I want to make the photo really artistic, black and white, sepia tone, things like this, I actually take my photo into Adobe Lightroom and I kind of play with it there. And I may actually do a tutorial later on that shows you how to take photos from your PlayStation 4, put them into Lightroom, or even Photoshop for those that don't have Lightroom, and then play around with the photos there. I think in a way you can really get some amazing shots and a lot better quality if you're utilizing Lightroom or Photoshop. But that's a whole nother video. I'll get to it at another point. So let's go back to none. Intensity. This is just basically the amount. This right here, the colorize. Let's say I did use this, and I like the vibrant. It really makes wide range of colors. But I don't like the intensity. I don't like how intense this is. So I'll bring this down, maybe half. I can bring it down all the way, and then it's like these don't do anything. But if I bring it up, it just barely overlays that filter onto the photo I'm taking. So that's a bit much. But again, I don't use these, so I'm going to set this to none, and that doesn't matter. So I like the brightness where it's at. I like the exposure. I think I might actually bring it up just a hair more. Maybe bring the brightness down just a bit. Okay, time of day. I don't really have to go over this, but I do want to say that I really love having control over the time of day. Not all in-game photo modes give you this option, but I think it's great, and I really hope that games in the future, if they do have photo mode, really implement time of day. It's self-explanatory. I don't have to explain this, but I like it because you can get the shadows exactly where you want them. You can get the highlights on the face, and in the real world, when you're taking portraits, and especially when you're looking at the face, you kind of want to see a little bit of shadow from the nose, because what happens. Let's do this. If I have a shot like that, like her face is kind of flat looking. I mean, it's very well lit, it looks nice, you can see everything, but it's not very dynamic. It's pretty flat. But if I take the lighting, watch her nose, watch the shadow, and I move this just a little, you see how the shadow starts to kind of go around the side of her face, and then also the nose casts a little bit of a shadow on her cheek. So this gives you some depth in the image. It just doesn't seem so flat. You really want to pay attention to shadows and where the light is in your photos. especially if you want to give them more dynamic nature, more depth to them. Um, so I like it kind of here. I think that looks pretty good. Border, small logo, we all know what that is. I don't utilize these either. Um, the greetings, that's strange. But it is what it is. Small logo. All right, let's go back. Okay, vignetting. Vignetting is nice. I actually have to admit I'm kind of a vignette addict. I've been known to overutilize it too much. Um, but go ahead and turn that on. I'll explain that. So vignetting, vignetting in real photography comes from how lenses actually work with your camera. As the image gets to the edge of the lens, light kind of light has a hard time coming in from the very edges of your lens, so it gets darker. And so sometimes you'll see, especially in old photographs, there's a little bit of a vignetting, darkness around the edge of the image, and that just has to do with how the lens is. A really high quality lens on a real camera reduces this vignetting effect, but a lot of people like it, and I especially like it. So there's a couple things with vignetting you want to be careful about. If you do it too much, it becomes too obvious, and you can see in the upper corners and the lower corners this black, dark. That can be distracting, actually, to a point. And I've been known to do that. Sometimes I'll take a photo and it's like this, and I used to love it, but now when I do that, I just see the vignetting, and I don't like it. But, everybody has their own technique. Everyone has their own style. So one other thing about vignetting, it has the um, it has this thing where if you vignette an image, your eyes are naturally drawn to the brighter part of the image, the center. So that's one reason to use vignetting. Much like blurring the background brings your attention to what is in focus, vignetting makes your eyes move more towards the middle of the image and not so much towards the outer edges. If I turn this vignetting off, I think the game has a little bit of its own vignetting, so there's still some in there. But if vignetting was all the way off, your eyes scan all over the image, which is fine. Sometimes there's beautiful things to look at in the corners. But with it on, automatically, you're just sort of drawn to the center. So let's do a little bit of vignetting. Maybe there, bring it back. Like I said, you don't want to do it too much. It can get stupid, and you can just yeah, it looks horrible. So let's bring this back. Bring this back. What am I doing here? I want it a little darker. I like that. Vignetting also has this effect of sort of making the colors pop. You see, the darker it gets, the colors tend to stand out. Oh, cracked a little there. The colors tend to stand out. So I like vignetting for that reason too. So let's do it. Ooh, I really like that. That looks nice. Okay, and you don't see too much darkening around the edges of the screen, so that looks really nice. One thing also, you remember when I was playing with the time of day, moving this around? Um, One thing you might want to do is when you change the sun, as with real photography, if you change your lighting, you have to go back and change your exposure and your brightness. So let's get this back to where I had it, where I like it. About there. So let's just double check the brightness. See how this is. I'm going to bring the brightness down a little bit. It tends to make the shadows come out. You have the bright areas, they really pop, but then you have these deep shadowy areas, and that gives you more depth in your image as well. I like where the exposure is, so I think we'll keep it like that. So that would be my photo within Horizon Zero Dawn. And so yeah, and I might actually go ahead and screen capture that. Maybe upload that later. Okay, so just to show you, compare, if we turn off depth of field, if we, let's see, if we put the brightness back to where it was, we don't have any of that. we put the change the time of day kind of back to where it was ish. So you see the difference. You have a lot of control over how the image looks. You can really play with the exposures, the color, everything. Now, if I were doing this, I wouldn't actually mess with the brightness and exposure too much. I would leave those kind of where they are by default. And then, like I said earlier, I would take this into Lightroom, and there I would play with the brightness and exposure, and also the vignetting. You just have way more control. It's meant for actual photography. But this is basically Horizon Zero Dawn photo mode in a nutshell. It's pretty self-explanatory. I love it. I think it's one of the best in-game photo modes that there is. But like I said, I haven't played Spider-Man, I haven't played God of War, but I've seen some phenomenal photographs come out of there. So hopefully this gives you a little bit more understanding of some of the terminology, some of the aspects within the photo mode, such as aperture, focal distance, things like that. And yeah, so happy shooting. I'd really like to see some work if any of you guys do any. You can catch me on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram, so don't forget to check out that. Also, to subscribe if you like these videos. It really is nice to know that people are watching these and I'm just not talking to the void in the internet. So like it if you like it. Subscribe if you want to see more. I think next week I'm going to try and do a video where I take these photos into Lightroom and show you a little bit about how Lightroom can make your photos just really pop, really dynamic. I also have another photo tutorial that I might do about stereoscopic photography. It's not too much different than this. It's really simple actually, but it's really interesting because if you have a VR headset, then you can do these stereoscopic images and then load them on your phone and basically see this game in 3D. It's a really interesting effect. I love it. I'm fascinated by it. It's kind of a side hobby of mine. So hopefully I'll get those videos up in the next couple weeks and I'll see you then. All right.